Hi, this is Kirby. It is March 31st, 2025. It is a Monday. And this podcast is going to be in honor of an artist who whose life was cut short for doing sort of exactly what I and other people do, which is connect the dots. His name is Mark Lombardi. And I am sure those of you who follow my work have heard about him. And for those of you who have not heard about him, I'm going to fill in the blanks. So it appears whenever I look into people, let's say, who make the very strong argument that someone like J.E. specifically only worked for, let's say, Mossad, as opposed to including the intelligence agencies of the United States, and or pay no attention to perhaps the UK and really the five English-speaking countries that form what is collectively known as the Five Eyes. They share intelligence gathering information. And I, at some point, began to refer to this as Six Eyes because it includes Israel, who has a very strong connection, as we all know, with the United States. Now, I'm going to just share first, sort of like a quick review and summary of who Mark Lombardi was. And then I'm going to share an interview, and I'm going to read it to you so it'll be easy to sort of like follow. That was done some years ago with the first person who wrote about him, his life, and his tragic ending. Now, his is an unusual unalivement, and no one believed that he had in fact done this. However, he was interested in many things, sort of like BCCI, which is the Bank of Credit and Commerce, that I have spoken about, that in fact I had forgotten I wrote about in my memoir, The Billionaire's Woman. Yeah, he was interested in the Nugan Hand Bank. He was interested in the Iran-Contra. He was interested in Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and the arming of Saddam Hussein. He was interested in Charles Keating, the Lincoln Savings debacle, George W. Bush, Jackson T. Stevens, the Clintons. He was interested in sort of all of the things that he was interested in Meyer Lansky, who was a partner, by the way, of my abuser's father, a partner of Meyer Lansky. Okay, he was interested in the P2 conspiracy, in Michelle Sindona, Roberto Calvi. All of these are subjects that I write about and that I too have found connections. They're all interconnected. Mark Lombardi, as an artist, visualized this in his mind because he too found all these connections. However, these connections were so disturbing to these very powerful entities that he sadly became a target. And so he was born on March 23rd, 1951. He was an American conceptual artist, and he specialized in drawings that documented, and it says alleged financial fraud, but I'm going to just say to you that none of this is, quote, alleged, because clearly he was unalived by himself for no purpose. So I'm going to just say, I'm going to read the word alleged, but I do not believe these are alleged financial crimes, but that was his focus. He kind of like followed the money, and also political frauds by power brokers. And in general, he focused on the use and abuse of power. So, I'm going to just say that he majored in art history at Syracuse University. He graduated in 1974 with a BA. And while still an undergraduate, he had a job as a researcher, chief researcher, for an exhibit in 1973 called Teapot Dome to Watergate. And all of these elements focused on various U.S. governmental scandals. And it was motivated by what was happening at the time, which was Watergate. So in 1975, a man by the name of James Harithus, who is the former director of the Everson Museum, hired him to be an assistant curator. Mark was really smart. He had a good eye. However, this is like in the belly of the beast. This is the Contemporary Arts Museum in Houston, Texas. Now, we know that Houston, Texas is the home of the Bush crime family. I'm just going to say it, the Bush crime family, the cartel. And so he worked there for approximately 2 years until 1976. And then he also opened a very small gallery, which he called Square One. And then he started to focus on the drug wars, and he began pursuing painting as sort of a hobby while he was archiving information. Now, 6 years before his unalivement, he switched to an analysis type of pencil drawing. So we see a lot of this spring up, let's say, after the arrest of J.E. in 2019. We see people doing these kinds of diagrams, let's say, connecting this to this to this to this. Mark was one of the people who first did this in a manner that was available to the public. Now, he only used publicly available information. It's not like he had insiders whispering into his ear. He was just looking at publicly available information, connecting this to this to this to this, and discovering that between this connection and that connection, for example, there were not, let's say, 6 degrees of separation, which in fact, I don't even believe that we have 6 degrees of separation for many reasons, which I will discuss in a separate podcast. But in fact, these were on the same level or 1 degree separated. And so one of the things that inspired him was a couple of things. He sort of began taking notes and sketching out a simple tree chart showing the breakdown of Adnan Khashoggi's American holdings. And then he began making more of these charts. And then he found more things about the so-called drug wars. We know we didn't have a drug war, okay? What we know, we had a drug importation. And then, he read a couple of the same books that I read, among them Pete Bruton's book on the SNL scandals. And, when I came across Pete Bruton's book, which I have, but I have a collection of many other books, the names are the same. And I repeat this in my own new research because I don't regurgitate old information. I sort of look at the landscape I look at not just what's publicly available, but I have an insider's perspective, having been in the situation that I was in with a billionaire in this elite group of people with access to the power brokers, let's say, because he too was a power broker. And so then in Pete Bruton's book, for example, he alleges that the Bush family, the CIA, and members of the mafia took part in a conspiracy to steal vast sums of money. And Pete Bruton, of course, is right about that. But there are, I had a thought, but I'm gonna save that for another day because I've got a lot of material to share with you here. So I'm gonna just read to you what he wrote himself uh for, let's say, I think one of the shows that he was invited to do. Now, these shows, let's say the people that attended these shows were CIA operatives. And there were a lot of these people very interested in the buzz his work was creating. And it did not go over well with these people. Hence the unaliving of somebody like Mark Lombardi, who had pieced together visual representations of the illegal alliances of very powerful people. And so what Mark himself wrote, he wrote the following. In 1994, I began a series of drawings I refer to as narrative structures. Most were executed in graphite or pen and ink on paper. Some are quite large, measuring up to 5 by 12 feet. I call them narrative structures because each consists of a network of lines and notations that are meant to convey a story, typically a recent event of interest to me, like the collapse of a large international bank, trading company, or investment house. One of my goals is to explore the interaction of political, social, and economic forces in contemporary affairs. Thus far, I have exhibited drawings on BCCI, Lincoln Savings, World Finance of Miami, the Vatican Bank, Silverado Savings, Castle Bank and Trust of the Bahamas, Nugan Hand Limited of Sydney, Australia, and many more. Working from syndicated news items and other published accounts, I began each drawing by compiling large amounts of information about a specific bank, financial group, or set of individuals. After a careful review of the literature, I then condensed the essential points into an assortment of notations and other brief statements of fact, out of which an image begins to emerge. My purpose throughout this is to interpret the material by juxtaposing and assembling the notations into a unified, coherent whole. In some cases, I used a set of stacked parallel lines to establish time frame. I'm sorry. These relationships, the flow of money, and other key details are then indicated by a system of radiating arrows, broken lines, and so forth. Some of the drawings consist of two different layers of information, one denoted in black, the other in red. Black represents the essential elements of the story, while major lawsuits, criminal indictments, or other legal actions taken against the parties are illustrated with red. Every statement of fact and connection depicted in the work is true and based on information culled entirely from the public record. Now, what I want to say is that he had put his notes onto index cards, and they were like, let's say, in excess of about 14,000 of these. Well, most of these disappeared after his unusual demise in his apartment in New York, specifically in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. But we're going to get to this. So after his horrific and tragic, let's say, ending, a woman by the name of Patricia Goldstone wrote a book about him. She had been a reporter for the Los Angeles Times and a bureau chief for Cablevision, and she had written for a lot of these magazines. She worked on a book called Interlock, and it was about art, conspiracy, and the shadow worlds of Mark Lombardi. And I, complete disclosure, I have not read her book, but it does cover, this interview covers information on Mark's life because she spoke to a lot of people. So that I'm going to read portions of this. So Patricia responds to a question. Mark was a conceptual artist, which means he essentially drew ideas and not water lilies. Some people consider to be the first great artist of the 21st century. He is unique in the art world because he used interlocks to create his art. Now, interlocks are basically a form of flowchart, tracing overly cozy relationships between board of directors. And they're common in accounting and in some forms of litigation, but they're very, very unusual in the art world. Mark used interlocks to draw what amounts to a continual visual history of the interconnections between intelligence and organized crime and corporations and governments in the shadow banking industry that we've heard so much about since 2007. He was particularly interested in tracing things like money laundering and tax evasion. He was actually way ahead of Edward Snowden and Julian Assange in releasing a very wide swath of extremely uncomfortable information to the public. What he created was a form of visual WikiLeaks. His own life is actually the missing strand and several of the shadowy visual narratives that make up his work. He, D-I-E-D, you cannot even say that word on this platform, people. And it was a very mysterious end of life. I mean, I'm going to have to substitute because we cannot say that word on this platform. And then she says, well, his research skills were like really well known in the Houston art world, which she describes as being, quote, very progressive in its politics in that time. I would have to disagree with her, but anyway, that's her take on it. And she said, I'm just going to skip over the things that I just find to be not of really. So, I mean, so what she wrote and how she commented was he was a very methodical and systematic researcher. He worked like a historian works. He learned about the flow of hot money largely through published material by well-respected academics and journals. His library, which she claims she ran through in the course of researching for her book, consisted of hundreds of books on the financial debacle he drew, which he rigorously boiled down to bullet points of essentially academically and dedicated information, which he compiled in thousands of 3x5 index cards. He would arrange these in a narrative design on the floor next to the drawing that he was composing, much like a film director uses a storyboard. And then she says that at the time, he was given a very large stash of internal memos and other primary documents by one of the participants of the scandals. And in these documents that were never previously published, these would be a prize for any serious historian. At the time, I discovered that he was taught how to do interlocks by the lawyer who deposed Richard Shelby, who was one of the major middlemen in the Iran-Contra scandal and in DCI. So his research was quite profoundly and professionally grounded. So she gives him credit, frankly, for the fact that his work, although he is called a conspiracy theorist, I mean, come on, conspiracy, which is just telling the truth about truth that the public is not told because we're fed a series of lies, is actually somebody who develops a very clear picture of what's going on in the world, and through their own way, and his way, it was through art. In my way, it's through writing. In other ways, it's through song for other people, if they can even get the song, played. Because we know that, we do live in, as we can see by the fact that his truth, which had to be, condensed into these drawings, were facts, just facts that are interspersed and presented to the public as one-off. Oh, this is one scandal. That's how the media portrays most things. This is one scandal, then they talk about another scandal. And for the average consumer of mainstream media, these one-off situations, oh, they're being looked at by the Senate, they're being looked, but what few people realize is that these investigations have no teeth. And what that means in legal terms is that none of the so-called, let's say, for example, the Frank Church investigation, the Church Committee, they could not send anyone to jail and did not. And, oh, the head of the CIA, well, he resigned. He was sort of like, he took an early leave of absence just before the committee hearings, wherein Colby stepped in. And then he's found to have been unalived in a very strange accident. However, returning to the conversation that his biographer had, he was now working for this guy, Jim Harithus, who was the director of the museum, and he was Mark's college teacher and his mentor. And then, however, Harithus terminated him after a famous impromptu Brett fight at a major art opening, which turned into a major brawl when certain of the very prominent guests, perhaps, because of the alcohol and the naughty nature of the proceedings, started ripping apart the installation and throwing it around. And then a couple of unidentified artists sailed into the melee and started punching the guests. And now Mark never spoke about these incidents again. And in fact, according to her, his ex-wife told her there was a good reason for his firing, who introduced into the conversation that he would actually get up and leave the room. But in his personal files, she claimed that she found a note, which looks like it was written by him. And it reads, in the late 1970s, which is when this incident occurred, I was working as an organizer of art exhibitions in the Houston area. First International Bank, which was George H.W. Bush's bank. They barged into the scene at about this time, effectively vetoing my participation in a large number of projects. So basically, what Mark had in fact realized and noted was these were agitators sent in to pretend they were part of the guests milling around, but who in fact destroyed his work, and they were people that belonged to HW. And then it was like a new form of journalism that he was doing, although he didn't realize the impact or the danger that he posed to, let's say, the Bush family. So she is then questioned about what happened to Mark's cards. And then she says, well, this is sort of a subjective number because I was told by one major collector of his work that there were as many as 40,000 file cards. And this collector had access to his studio, but what is archived at the Museum of Modern Art is in Long Island. The number is about 14,000, which is frankly the number that I quoted at the beginning of this podcast. But it looks like even I did not know how many cards there actually were. But 40,000 cards, when you start amassing information, you end up having more than 40,000 notes, quite frankly. I mean, because I've done, sorry, I've done that. In any event, give this a like. I'm gonna have to jump off, but I'll continue.